In a quiet town nestled just beyond the edge of Knoxville, Tennessee, life moved slowly. The people there valued privacy, tradition, and keeping their noses out of others' business. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved from porches, but didn't ask questions, where secrets could grow like mold behind closed doors. At the center of one such closed-off home lived George Rowley, a 42-year-old man with calloused hands and tired eyes. He worked the night shift at a steel plant, returning home just before dawn. To most, he was a man of few words, someone who had endured hardship and simply carried on. His wife had passed away from cancer over a decade ago, and ever since, it had been just him and his daughter, Bethany. Bethany Rowley was a quiet girl. She had been homeschooled since the age of 8, shortly after her mother's death. While other children played outside, Bethany rarely left the house. She didn't attend birthday parties or join sports teams. By the time she reached her teenage years, she was a ghost in the town's memory. No one really saw her. Some neighbors speculated she might be ill. Others assumed George was just being protective, a single father trying to keep his only child safe from the world. But as the years passed, it became clear that Bethany wasn't just sheltered, she was hidden. Inside their modest one-story home, life followed a strict routine. George cooked all the meals, decided what shows they watched on TV, and monitored everything Bethany did online. He rarely let her have a phone, and when he did, he kept it locked with parental controls. She never had social media. All her schooling came from outdated books and handwritten assignments George created himself. On the rare occasions she was seen outside, she was either walking closely behind him or sitting silently in the passenger seat of his rusted pickup truck. Still, no one asked questions. People chalked it up to grief. Losing a spouse changes a man, they'd say, and George had lost his whole world. But grief doesn't always look like sadness. Sometimes it twists into something darker, something harder to see. Bethany turned 19 in the spring, but there was no party, no friends, no celebration. She remained in that house, invisible to the outside world. It was around this time that she began logging onto a public internet forum late at night, using an old laptop George didn't know still worked. The forum was a support space for young women coping with difficult family situations. She never used her real name. Instead, she called herself Sunset Shadows and posted short messages, some vague, others terrifying in their implications. She wrote about feeling trapped, about not knowing where love ended and control began. Her messages were filled with confusion and self-blame. At first, she said she didn't want to hurt him. Then she said she didn't want to hurt herself. One particular post caught the attention of a moderator. Bethany had written that the man raising her had stopped feeling like a father a long time ago. She said she couldn't breathe inside that house anymore, that she felt like she was losing her mind. The moderator responded, urging her to get help, asking if she was in immediate danger. But Bethany never replied. Her account went silent for 3 weeks. And then one morning, everything shattered. A neighbor named Irene, who lived 2 houses down, was walking her dog when she saw a barefoot figure sprinting across her front yard. It was Bethany. Her face was pale, her arms smeared with blood, her eyes blank like she wasn't really there. Irene called 911 immediately, her voice trembling. By the time the police arrived at the Rowley house, the calm that had defined that quiet street was gone. Something terrible had finally crawled out from behind those walls, something no one had dared to imagine. And the small, silent town that once prided itself on minding its own business could no longer ignore what it had chosen not to see. The police arrived at the Rowley residence just minutes after the 911 call. The front door was unlocked, slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. The home was dim, with curtains drawn tightly over every window. The air inside was stale, filled with a sharp, metallic scent that made officers pause. As they moved through the Hallway, they found streaks of blood leading toward the kitchen. Nothing was overturned, no signs of a struggle, only a disturbing silence that clung to every corner of the house. In the kitchen, George Rowley lay motionless on the floor, his body positioned awkwardly between the refrigerator and the breakfast table. He had been stabbed multiple times, mostly in the chest and upper neck. The wounds were deep and deliberate. Blood had pooled beneath him, soaking into the grout of the tiled floor. Near his outstretched hand was a small photograph, its corners worn, the image stained. It was a picture of Bethany as a child, smiling and unaware of the dark future that would unfold. Bethany was found not far from the house, wandering barefoot through a field, her nightgown stained with blood. She didn't resist when officers approached. She didn't speak, didn't cry, just stared at them as though she didn't understand where she was. She was taken into custody and placed under observation. At the time, no one knew what had happened, only that a daughter had seemingly killed her father, and the town wanted answers. Inside the house, investigators began collecting evidence. What they found turned a case of apparent parricide into something far more disturbing. In George's bedroom, under a loose floorboard, detectives discovered a wooden box filled with dozens of photographs. Many were of Bethany, taken in the privacy of her bedroom, bathroom, even while she slept. Some images were recent, others dated back years. It became clear that these were not innocent family pictures. They were something darker, obsessive, secretive, and deeply inappropriate. Beside the box was a notebook filled with George's handwriting. His entries were personal, erratic, and filled with disturbing declarations. He wrote about Bethany as if she were not his daughter, but a lover. He described moments of emotional closeness, moments he believed were signs of something more. The entries became increasingly unhinged as the months went on. He wrote about how no one understood them, how society's rules didn't apply to their kind of bond. He claimed they were connected beyond flesh, beyond morality. In one entry, he wrote that if anyone tried to separate them, he would take her away forever. Forensic teams also found a burner phone hidden inside the laundry room cabinet. It contained text messages sent to a contact labeled Freedom Plan. The messages referenced creating new identities, finding safe houses, and leaving the state. George had been planning to disappear with Bethany. One message read, "She's starting to doubt, but I can fix it. We leave in 3 days." Back at the station, Bethany remained silent. A psychologist was brought in to assess her mental state. The initial report described her as emotionally detached, severely traumatized, and showing signs of long-term psychological manipulation. She wasn't just a suspect, she was also a victim, one who had lived under the control of a man who had blurred every boundary that should have protected her. The case began to shift. This wasn't just a murder. It was the unraveling of a secret, so disturbing that it shattered the town's sense of normalcy. People who had known George for years couldn't reconcile the man they remembered with the truths now coming to light. The quiet, respectful father was gone. In his place stood the image of a man consumed by delusion, capable of shaping a nightmare behind closed doors. Bethany's silence wasn't just shock. It was the weight of years spent in a world where wrong was passed off as love, where control wore the mask of care. And now that mask had finally been ripped away. As investigators continued to sift through the evidence, a fuller picture of the toxic dynamic between George and Bethany began to emerge. The truth was darker than anyone had anticipated, not just in the crime itself, but in the psychological labyrinth that had led to it. Forensic analysts had already determined that the stabbing was not the result of a sudden altercation, but rather a series of deliberate actions. There were no defensive wounds on George's body, indicating he had likely been asleep or otherwise incapacitated when the attack began. This detail pointed to planning something the prosecution would eventually argue in court. But what they couldn't ignore was the overwhelming evidence of manipulation and grooming. that had occurred over the course of Bethany's life. Bethany's bedroom became a key point of investigation. Unlike the rest of the house, it felt frozen in time. The furniture was childlike, almost untouched since she was a little girl. A bookshelf lined with outdated children's novels sat beside a dresser full of modest clothes, all chosen to conceal rather than express. But the most disturbing discovery came when investigators opened a locked metal box under her bed. Inside, they found Bethany's personal diary, written in small, controlled handwriting. The diary chronicled years of confusion, emotional dependency, and deep psychological entanglement. At first, the entries were vague mentions of being uncomfortable, feeling watched, and not understanding why certain things felt wrong. But as the years progressed, so did the clarity. The entries shifted into accounts of coercion masked as affection, of a father who crossed boundaries slowly, methodically, and without remorse. She wrote about the fear of disappointing him, about being told their connection was special, something rare and misunderstood. One particular entry stood out to investigators. Dated 3 weeks before the murder, Bethany wrote about finding George's plan to run away. She had discovered a folder on his hidden laptop containing fake birth certificates, new names, and an itinerary for a bus trip to Canada. She wrote that she felt sick, like she had been drugged by years of manipulation and was finally waking up. She wanted out, but didn't know how. She ended the entry with a sentence that would haunt even the most seasoned detectives. "If I stay, I disappear. If I leave, he'll destroy me." The psychological profile drawn by experts painted a tragic picture. Bethany had grown up in complete emotional captivity. George had isolated her from the world, stripped her of any external relationships, and rewired her understanding of love and loyalty. What the town had mistaken as an overprotective father was actually a man constructing a private world where he held all the power. Neighbors who were interviewed recalled odd moments that, in hindsight, felt chilling. A teacher from the church Bethany occasionally attended remembered her once asking if it was wrong to love someone in a way that the world doesn't understand. A local grocery clerk remembered George refusing to let Bethany speak for herself at checkout. Tiny warnings, all overlooked. The court-appointed psychiatrist who evaluated Bethany described her as exhibiting signs of complex trauma, emotional disassociation, and conditioned submission. She wasn't just a girl who killed her father. She was a girl whose entire reality had been bent around a lie so convincing it took years to even recognize it as abuse. Public opinion began to divide. Some saw her as a murderer, others as a tragic victim who had finally broken. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs demanding justice, while others lit candles for a young woman they believed had been failed by everyone around. Her dot as the trial loomed, the narrative was no longer simple. It wasn't just about what happened the night George died. It was about everything that had led up to that moment. A slow, invisible erosion of a young girl's identity, and the horrifying consequences when the weight of that erosion finally collapsed. Asterisk in the weeks leading up to the trial, Bethany was transferred to a mental health unit within a secure facility. There, she remained withdrawn and barely spoke, her days spent staring out of small windows, tracing the patterns of trees and clouds like they held the answers to her silence. But even in that silence, professionals could see the layers of damage. She flinched at sudden movements, avoided eye contact with men, and refused to sleep unless her door remained open. Her body had left George's house, but her mind hadn't. Meanwhile, prosecutors worked to build a case that would withstand public scrutiny. Though they couldn't ignore the overwhelming evidence of long-term abuse, they also couldn't ignore that George Rowley had died from 13 stab wounds. The number suggested rage, not panic. They argued that the act had crossed the line from self-defense into cold-blooded killing. The fact that Bethany had waited until George was asleep, found a weapon, and continued striking even after the first blow pointed toward intent. To them, the premeditation was clear, but the defense had its own story to tell, one rooted in psychology, isolation, and the terrifying effects of grooming. Their case centered not on denying the killing, but on explaining how Bethany had reached the point of no return. Expert witnesses were brought in to discuss coercive control, trauma bonding, and the irreversible damage caused by prolonged emotional manipulation. They painted a portrait of a girl who had been raised not just in captivity, but in a twisted illusion of love so powerful that by the time she recognized it as abuse, she had already lost her sense of agency. Evidence from George's journals and Bethany's diary became central to the case. The defense read aloud passages where George wrote about claiming her, about being the only one who could love her right, and about how the world was poisoned with judgment. They pointed to messages on the burner phone where he spoke to an unknown contact about starting fresh in another country, suggesting he was willing to sever her last ties to the outside world. They argued that George was preparing to isolate her permanently, and Bethany saw no other way out. What swayed many onlookers was the discovery of a final, chilling note George had written the night before his death. In it, he spoke of Bethany, hesitating, of her being confused by outside ideas, and how he would make sure she never doubted again. Though it wasn't clear what he meant, the implication felt sinister. To the defense, it was the final straw, a threat veiled. In controlled as the trial unfolded, media outlets descended on the quiet town. Headlines screamed about incest, murder, and psychological horror. Commentators debated whether Bethany was a victim or a manipulative killer hiding behind a facade of trauma. People who had never met her weighed in with opinions formed from soundbites and clickbait. But inside the courtroom, it wasn't about public perception. It was about a girl who had lived her entire life in a cage built by the one person who should have protected her. Whether her actions were justifiable or not, the reality remained. Bethany had never been given a chance to become her own person. She was molded, shaped, and emotionally weaponized by a man who used fatherhood as a disguise for possession. After days of harrowing testimony, the judge ordered a psychological evaluation to determine her state of mind at the time of the killing. The results were clear. Bethany had suffered from severe trauma-induced dissociation. She didn't act out of vengeance or malice. She acted out of a fractured survival instinct, a final attempt to reclaim her life before it was erased completely. Prosecution, seeing the weight of the evidence, offered a plea deal: manslaughter under extreme emotional disturbance. 12 years, parole eligible after 6. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as Bethany accepted. No outburst, no tears. Just a quiet nod, as though she had known all along that freedom would come at a cost. Bethany was transferred to a women's correctional facility several counties away. Her arrival sparked curiosity and whispers among both inmates and staff. Everyone had heard the headlines, the shocking story of a daughter who had stabbed her father to death. But once the truth behind those headlines surfaced, the manipulation, the control, the years of psychological damage, opinions shifted. Some viewed her as a broken girl seeking redemption. Others saw her as dangerous, unpredictable, and emotionally unstable. But Bethany, as always, remained quiet. She kept to herself, rarely speaking unless spoken to, and spent most of her days in the library or in counseling sessions. She began to write again, this time for herself. Pages filled with memories, fragmented and unclear, slowly started to resemble a story. In therapy, she spoke of the years she couldn't get back, of the moments that still haunted her when she tried to sleep. The boundaries between love and fear were still tangled in her mind. Sometimes she'd describe feelings that didn't make sense even to her: anger toward George, sorrow over his death, guilt for surviving. Healing was not a straight line. It came in small pieces, and sometimes it didn't come at all. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, The town that once ignored the signs began to reflect. George Rowley's house remained empty, its windows boarded up, its paint peeling in the fun. No one wanted to live there. Rumors spread about strange sounds, cursed walls, and shadows in the windows. Whether or not those things were real didn't matter. The place had become a symbol, a reminder of what happens when silence is chosen over action. Bethany's case sparked national conversations about psychological abuse, incest, and coercive control. Advocacy groups referenced her trial when pushing for reform in how the justice system handles victims who fight back against their abusers. Some states even began reevaluating their definitions of consent and emotional manipulation. Her story, once buried beneath scandal and shame, began to mean something more. 6 years passed. Bethany became eligible for parole. A small panel sat across from her, reading her file, asking her questions about remorse, rehabilitation, and her plans if released. She answered with honesty, sometimes hesitating, other times speaking clearly and firmly. She didn't ask for sympathy. She didn't deny her actions. She simply explained the life she had lived, the choices she had made, and the person she hoped to become. They granted her release. She left prison with nothing but a plastic bag of clothes, a worn journal, and a state-issued identification card. There was no one waiting outside the gate, no friends, no family, just the open road and the uncertain future. But for the first time, Bethany was free to choose her own direction. She moved to a small town under a different name, enrolled in online college courses, and began volunteering at a support center for abused women. She didn't tell anyone her past. She simply listened to others and offered quiet support. It was her way of rebuilding, not just her life, but her sense of worth. But the past didn't disappear. There were days it returned in wave, a flash of memory, a word that echoed too closely, the smell of steel or blood. There were nights she'd wake up unable to breathe, feeling the weight of everything she'd survived pressing against her chest. But she never let it consume her again. Each morning, she reminded herself she was no longer trapped. Bethany's story never made headlines again. There were no documentaries, no book deals, no interviews. She faded into the world away,